I'm going to assume everybody is okay. Okay, it's telling me recording will start soon. I'm going to assume it's now. So, right. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
See, it says nematoda, about 28,000 described species.
You got it.
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. I take it you'll just mute your mics, but you'll raise your, you'll turn them on if you have a question. I'm sitting here in an empty room lecturing, and I'm starting to think, there have been classes that have been pretty similar to this feeling. But you should have seen this before. There's about 28,000 described species. They're everywhere. I quoted the guy who said that if you could sweep away all of the matter in the universe except the nematodes, you could still make out the Earth. And there's a whole lot of parasitic taxa, as well as a whole bunch of free-living ones. We currently divide them into two major classes, Chromadoria and Enoplia. Both of them do have parasitic members. Animal parasites, both of them have plant parasites, and both have free-living members as well. I'm not going to hit you guys much on the distinctions between them. Enoplia tend to have a more straight gut. Chromadoria have a bottle-shaped gut with a bulb. Enoplia has simpler excretory system. I'm not going to worry about that. Most Enoplians are non-parasitic. The parasites tend to be in one particular subclass, subclass Dorilema. That includes the trichinellids, which is what I'm going to talk about today. There's also the dioctophimatids. The notorious ones naturally parasitize things like mink and otter, but some of them can parasitize dogs. So you vet people might conceivably see them at some point. Myrmiphids are parasites of invertebrates, and they're used for biological control. And Muspiciids, no one seems to know anything about. And then those other two don't have any parasitic members. Okay, in that first group, one of the big ones is Trichuris. This is the human whipworm, Trichuris trichiura, and there's closely related species that can infect dogs. That's Trichuris vulpes, I think. There's a cat species, there's a pig species, I think there's a sheep species. I ran across a paper this morning about some from monkeys, so they probably infect a pretty wide spectrum of mammals. And they're called whipworms because they look like a whip with a thick handle. The narrow part, the whip part, is actually the head end, and then the swollen up part that looks like the handle of the whip is the tail. That tail end in the male is coiled. That's actually pretty typical. So very distinctive look right here. Looking like, a whip with a very long, narrow business end and then a thicker, somewhat shorter handle. In humans, Trichuris is especially common where feces get used as fertilizer. These are gut parasites. Eggs pass out in the feces and are ingested, so the life cycle is basically fecal-oral, but you can't get these through contact with fresh poop because the eggs have to develop outside the body, and in typical warmish temperatures that takes about 21 days. So the eggs are, when they pass out, the embryo hasn't even started developing. It'll soon divide again, and by about 21 days, there's a clearly visible worm embryo there. And then those get passed on, usually because of contamination of food. So if your food is grown in a place where human feces are used as fertilizer, you're at some risk for infection there. And there's an estimated 600 to 700 million people infected worldwide, most of them tropical. I vaguely remember seeing there were about 2 million cases of infection in the US. So this is the kind of thing you could certainly see here. That's actually somebody's colonoscopy. The larvae hatch in the small intestine. They migrate to the cecum. The cecum is that blind pouch where the small intestine joins the large. There's an extension of the cecum called the appendix. And then the adults will take up residence in the large intestine, and that long, narrow anterior end, they literally thread right through the mucous tissue. So that long, narrow end is embedded in the intestinal mucosa. Something went beep, so I assume everything is okay. And then they reproduce with those swollen tail ends sticking out. So there's a couple I cribbed from a medical case report of a guy who'd been on a mission trip to the Philippines, if memory serves. So what you're seeing is those thick tail ends sticking out, and the long, narrow heads are kind of strung right through the tissue. All right, everything going okay? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Okay, sorry, I forgot to warn you before switching over to this slide, because this is a prolapsed rectum. Rectum? Damn near killed him. Sorry. This is what can happen in really severe cases, because those thread-like anterior parts of the worm, they destroy connective tissue, they cause the tissues to swell, and the combination of swelling and lack of structural support means that the rectum can actually turn itself inside out and get pushed out of the body. You can see the worm bodies partially sticking out of the rectal mucosa right there. It also hurts. You can get diarrhea, anemia because of bleeding, and secondary bacterial infection is also a problem if bacteria get into damaged parts of the tissue. This is no real fun to have. It does only last about a year. If you're infected, the infection will clear up in about a year if you do nothing. But in areas where human feces are used for fertilizer without treatment, you may get constantly reinfected. And with thanks to Nick, on the left, I think that's a hookworm egg, he said, but on the right, that's the dog species, which last I looked, they were calling Trichiurus vulpes. Very distinctive look to these eggs. They look like footballs. And I don't know if you can see my little pointer right there, but on the ends of the football, you can see these translucent areas. Those are called polar plugs. And what they allow the embryo to do is they're an exit. They're like the trapdoor that I think we saw on some fluke eggs. So this is what you would look for in an infected dog. Humans are practically the same. All of them, as far as I know, are the same. Little known fact about archaeology: feces can harden if they contain lots of phosphate. And they'll contain lots of phosphate if you're eating lots of small fish and swallowing the bones. You know, if you're chowing down on sardines or things like that, which seems to have been true of the Vikings. And during excavations in the English city of York, excavating under, in this particular case, a new branch of Lloyd's Bank, archaeologists have found lots of Viking artifacts at York. These include ancient latrine pits whose contents could be analyzed. So we know a lot about what the Vikings were actually eating. We can find fruit seeds and fragments of bran and things like that. And they also found the largest human coprolite ever found. That is an 8-inch long Viking turd. on display as a treasured museum exhibit. If anybody wants to unmute the mic and go, wow, I'll wait. Okay, guess not. All right. And this explains why the Vikings were in such a bad temper. Vikings were heavily parasitized with whipworm. They had other parasites as well. Actual eggs have been recovered at York. These are from Viborg in Denmark, which is another place where Viking poop was recovered and subject to analysis. And we know that humans have gotten these ever since 7000 BC at Çatalhöyük in Turkey, which is one of the first agricultural towns. This is right about the time that people were figuring out how to domesticate animals and how to domesticate wild grasses and breed them into the grain species that we know. And it's probably not a coincidence that the oldest evidence of whipworm comes at about the time that humans were domesticating livestock and cultivating things in fields. Yeah, this is one of these things that tend to go together. Because somebody was interested, a couple of people have asked questions about this. The FDA has actually approved as an experimental treatment the eggs of the pig whipworm, Trichuris suis. Insert line about woo pig suis here. These don't live very long in humans. They will hatch, but they can't do much damage, and importantly, they don't reproduce within humans. And the eggs have been tested therapeutically to treat autoimmune diseases. I think I mentioned earlier that theory that autoimmune disease results when you don't give the immune system enough to do. And by stimulating it with low levels of parasite infection, you can actually improve its functioning and keep it from attacking normal parts of the body. And I came across this study from 2005 where they had patients swallowing 2,500 Trichuris suis eggs every 2 weeks. Up there at the top is the control group. That y-axis right there is just an index of the severity of symptoms. And after about beginning at 6 weeks, the differences between the control group and the experimental group, which was swallowing Trichuris suis eggs, was statistically significant. It's not really a cure, but it does seem to help. I'm not going to advise that anybody try this, and I shouldn't be giving medical advice, but last I checked, it is being looked into, and the FDA has approved it for clinical trials. So there's a link to the original paper if anybody would like to see. Okay, y'all still there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
All right. Everybody happy and thoroughly chuffed?
I'm vaguely disgusted, but generally I am. So.
Okay. All right. We're all on our places with bright, shiny faces. Good. Okay. Let's go back to presenting. And we'll share. I think there's a couple of gross pictures in the next half coming up, so just be advised. The other big one in this group is trichinella, not the same as trichuris. Trichinella used to be called Trichinella spiralis. Last I looked, they think it's a species complex now, so I'm not sure what the latest on the taxonomy is. But this is the causative agent of trichinosis. And like Trichuris, the head is the narrow end, and the adults burrow into gut mucosa, burrow into that layer of epithelium that secretes mucus in the intestine. That's a cross-section through an infected person's gut lining. And these little projections right there are, of course, the villi for absorption of digested food. And right there in the middle, that hollow thing is a trichinella. And in 3 dimensions, they quite literally string themselves through multiple cells. They'll actually penetrate one cell after another and string through them kind of like beads. This interferes with absorption of food. So the symptoms of heavy infections are pretty much your typical malabsorption syndrome. When you can't absorb food properly, you get diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, similar to what you would get with things like giardia, which also interferes with food absorption. They lay eggs, and the eggs hatch into larvae, but the larvae don't pass out in feces. This one is not transmitted by the fecal-oral route. The larvae migrate through the body, and they'll do damage to any organ that they burrow through, potentially including the brain, heart, lungs, or kidneys. They also cause immune reactions, and these can include skin rashes popping up. They can also include swelling in various regions. You can see that this person has a lot of swelling around the eyes, both above and below. That's a symptom of this. This is part of the reaction to trichinella larvae burrowing through the body. And the larvae actually end up inside muscle cells. They're the largest known intracellular parasites that spend their lives inside single cells. There you can see a muscle fiber with several little larval nematodes just coiled up, sleeping peacefully. The pointer is on one of them. And there's some very heavily infected muscle. The larvae don't directly, one single larva doesn't do that much, but if you have lots of them in there, it's enough to reduce the power output of the muscle and the muscle's ability to contract. And for some reason, trichinella really likes hanging out in the diaphragm, which is one muscle you really don't want to reduce the power output of. I found out that when slaughterhouse inspectors go inspecting meat, what they usually sample in pigs or cows is the diaphragm. In pigs, they'll also sample the tongue, and they'll sample one of the big jaw muscles called the masseter. And those are apparently favorite places for trichinella to hang out. In cows, I don't know if they sample the diaphragm. Cow diaphragm actually gets sold. Your fajitas are probably made out of it, although they would call it strip steak. Don't know if you really wanted to know that, but there you have it. But I'm given to understand that pig diaphragms are usually discarded because they give you a higher risk of getting trichinella. If you eat infected meat, the larvae will pass through your digestive system, pop right out in your intestine, burrow right into your cells, and round goes the circle of life. With me there?
Yes.
Okay. I can't make eye contact, and I want to make sure that I'm not talking to a screen with no presence right there. I want to make sure that people are listening. So
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here too.
Okay. Hello. All right. When the larvae penetrate individual muscle cells, they can actually alter the host cell gene expression. These are 2 cross sections of larvae. The one on the left is cut, passes several times through one of those coils. So you're seeing a bunch of cross sections. And then at a 90-degree angle on the right, you can see a cut that cuts through the long axis. You can see the body cut in a different sectional plane. Those infected muscle cells get turned into nurse cells, and they start producing endothelial growth factor, vascular endothelial growth factor, which causes a network of capillaries to grow around the nerve cell and start pumping it full of nutrients. So this is neat. You have a parasite that is able to engineer its host to supply it with more food, which is kind of cool and kind of horrifying. All right, there's your CDC life cycle. Humans usually get this from eating pork, and humans don't normally transmit trichinella except in very unfortunate cases because you get it from eating meat. So, you know, the only way you could catch it from another human would be to cannibalize that human. Now, I'm not prepared to say that we're not living in a post-apocalyptic nightmare and just haven't realized it yet. But if we are and we do have to resort to cannibalism, just make sure you cook your fellow man first. And the same thing is true with pork. This is why nobody eats rare pork, as far as I know. Actually, I think it might be a dish in some parts of the world, but it's not really a good idea because most people get it from eating infected pork. Now, you'll notice that you've got two different cycles that trichinella can cycle in, the domestic cycle at the top and the sylvatic cycle at the bottom. Brace yourself for somewhat disturbing slides to follow. The domestic cycle is transmitted among domestic pigs. And domestic pigs, if they're not kept properly, you know, if they're kept hungry and they're kept crowded and stressed, they will scavenge each other's corpses given the chance. Ideally, if you're raising pigs, you don't let them do this, but it does happen. And if a live pig eats a dead pig, the live pig can get infected with trichinella. It can also pass from pigs to rats or rats to pigs. If a pig eats an infected rat or a rat scavenges a dead pig, it'll pass that way. And then humans can get it from eating infected pigs. Or I guess infected rats, although we don't usually do that. That's the domestic cycle. One more slightly disturbing slide. That's a wild boar scavenging the carcass of a bear. In the wild, it gets transmitted among bears, rats, foxes, coyotes, boars, other wild animals that will prey on and or scavenge each other. Unlike what we've seen before, there's no really fixed life cycle. It's not like the flukes where you have to eggs go from a wading bird to a snail, and then from a snail to a fish, and then from a fish to a bird, or whatever it is. These can just cycle among whoever is eating whoever. And that's the sylvatic cycle from the Latin word for a forest. Humans can get it this way as well by eating undercooked game. If you eat wild boar and you don't cook it thoroughly, you can get this. There have been cases of people eating bear meat, which supposedly is pretty good. But if you undercook your bear, you can end up with trichinosis. And I came across at least one report of somebody getting this from eating undercooked raccoon. I assume the person was a Cajun. You know, in South Louisiana, you know, Cajuns will eat anything that won't eat them first. If an infected animal or person is not eaten, the body just calcifies the cyst of trichinella. This is what's happened here. One of those at the top is pretty completely calcified. The one down below is not completely. You can still see some of the larva inside, and the cyst will die, but this can take years to happen. This is how they were discovered. A guy by the name of James Paget in London in 1835 was dissecting a cadaver's diaphragm and noticed that the muscle was full of these little gritty grains that were making his scalpel dull. And what they were was calcified trichinella cysts from an old infection. And it was actually Paget's professor, a guy named Richard Owen, that rushed into print with this discovery and described and named trichinella. And then the life cycle was worked out by several people, mostly in the 1860s and 1870s. All right, how did that go?
I'm fine with it.
Okay. All right, I'm going to stop recording.
I never expected to write the word cannibal pigs in my notebook, but here we are.
Okay. Yeah, cannibal pigs.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a good one. All right. Any other questions? Anybody?
Nope.
Okay. All right. That went a little faster than I thought it would. Do you want to sign off?
I mean, we're done.
Okay. All right. I will stop recording. Okay. How do I stop recording? And